So one of the things that attracted me to the center 32 years ago when I first came was the part of its mission, which is to foster the development of a new worldview in which science and mysticism can be seen as different but complementary ways of describing the same underlying reality. So this raises the question, what is the way that mysticism describes this underlying reality? What is this underlying reality, and how does science describe it, and how can we put these two together? Those are some big questions, but I'd like to at least provide an overview of a sketch of how a new worldview that does this might look. What are some of the components of it, and the basic perspective that the center's offering to maybe providing such a worldview. So starting with the mystics, how do the mystics view this reality? Well, first of all, who are these mystics? Well, they can be distinguished from the regular believers or religionists by the fact that they testify to a reality that can be directly realized. They're not mere believers in a doctrine, but they teach practices that allow one to transform oneself experientially, that can potentially culminate in a fundamental realization of ultimate reality. This realization is called variously in different traditions gnosis or enlightenment or liberation of the ultimate reality, which might be called God or Brahman or the Tao. But this basic idea is the same. This is what distinguishes the mystics from the other believers in religion. So for example, here's what the Hindu sage Shankara says: the spiritual seekers, those great-hearted souls who have freed themselves from all cravings, casting aside sensual pleasures, tranquil and self-controlled, they realize this supreme truth of Brahman. They attain union with Brahman and reach the highest bliss. So this isn't something that happens in the afterlife or something. This is a realization that every human has the potential of experiencing in this lifetime. The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart says, when the kingdom appears to the soul and it is recognized, there is no further need for preaching or instruction. It is learned enough and has at once secured eternal life. So this goes beyond the doctrines of religion. It's a direct realization. So we can define the mystics as those people who have had this realization or gnosis. So then that raises the question, well, what is this gnosis? What is this ultimate reality that they claim to have realized? Well, we have these different names for it, God and Brahman and Allah, but how do the mystics define that? What do they say about it? What is this reality they say they've discovered? Well, they can't say what it is. And they tell us as much. Ibn Arabi says, the Gnostics know, but what they know cannot be communicated. Lao Tzu says the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. And in the Upanishads we read, he comes to the thought of those who know him beyond thought, not to those who imagine he can be attained by thought. So they can't say what this ultimate reality is, but of course they go ahead and try anyway. And people press them to say, well, what can you say? Please say something. So they do speak about ultimate reality, but the catch is that when they try to speak of ultimate reality, they inevitably end up contradicting themselves. So, for example, Nagarjuna says, everything is true, nothing is true. Everything's both true and not true. Everything is neither true nor not true. This is the teaching of the Buddha. So if your mind thinks it's grasped onto something, just read that. And Nicholas of Cusa, a Christian mystic, who I'm pretty sure never read Nagarjuna, wrote that I have found the abode wherein you dwell unveiledly, an abode surrounded by the coincidence of contradictories. So he directly describes this as this place where opposites coincide. The coincidence of contradictories. So ultimate reality can't be described, but not in a consistent way at least. It can be described as long as you're willing to contradict yourself, but then what are you really saying if you're saying two opposites at the same time? So we talk here about what the mystics testify in this universal truth, but ultimately they can't say what it is, and they can't put it into some fixed doctrine for us to nail down in one particular way. As Nagarjuna says, the ultimate truth transcends all definitions and descriptions, transcends all comments and disputations, transcends all words. So if the mystics and the scientists are describing the same underlying reality, it can't be the ultimate truth that this description is talking about. It's a relative truth. So if you want to know the ultimate truth, you're not going to find it in any doctrine, in any specific teaching, in any worldview. The realization goes beyond that. So that's the most fundamental teaching that they all agree on. But here we are trying to foster the creation of this new worldview. So this isn't about creating some ultimate framework that's going to be the end of all worldviews, any more than a musical composer will compose the ultimate symphony that's going to be the end of all symphonies, or a novelist will compose the one and finally great novel that will end all novels, or anything like that. But hopefully it will be a useful worldview, just like all mystical teachings hopefully will be useful within a relative context. And that's the key here, is that any teaching takes place within some context. And the basic, most fundamental context of all contexts, you might say, is created when a single distinction is made. And this basic fundamental distinction isn't the distinction between apples and oranges. If you want to distinguish between apples and oranges, you've already distinguished fruit from things that aren't fruit. You've distinguished objects from things that are aware of objects. And so there's more fundamental distinctions behind those derivative distinctions, you might say. So the mystics all testify that there's a kind of fundamental distinction that is at the root of all other distinctions. And it's characterized in various different ways, and you'll hear about these polarities, these contradictories that coincide ultimately. For example, the mystics will often talk about relative versus absolute truth. There's the absolute truth that cannot be put into words, at least not without contradiction. And then there's the relative truth that can be taught within a context. There's the duality and there's non-duality, which itself is a duality. There's the subject and the object, the knower and the known, awareness and phenomena. There's emptiness and form, nothing and something, ignorance and gnosis, delusion and enlightenment, bondage and liberation. These are all aspects of this most fundamental distinction that's made, and they're all kind of tied together in this first distinction that's made. When this first distinction is made, you might say all these polarities are kind of all wrapped up into one. In the Hindu tradition, they talk about being consciousness and bliss as being these different aspects of the one. It's kind of like that. The first distinction has all of these kind of wrapped up within it. There are different ways of describing the same fundamental distinction that arises. So when there's the distinction between subject and object, immediately there's a bondage or delusion that goes along with that. There's a distinction between relative and absolute that goes along with that. So this context that arises with the first distinction it's the seed of all the relative world that then unfolds after that. And within that context, you have the mystical teachings that start with this assumption that there is delusion, that there's a sentient being that wants to be relieved of suffering, that wants liberation, that believes it's in bondage and wants to have this gnosis to liberate it from this bondage. And so the relative teachings take place within that context. They take that for granted and move forward from there. So for example, Shankara says within this context of the relative teachings, reality is attained through discrimination. So there's a particular practice. He's assuming that you haven't attained reality, and here's how you attain it. You practice this thing called discrimination. And he continues by saying, Brahman is real, the universe is unreal. A firm conviction that this is so is called discrimination between eternal and non-eternal. So he's making these distinctions here. He's working within this context of duality. And we've missed one half of reality, you might say, and so he's emphasizing the other half. We're identified with forms and objects and the universe and have forgotten or ignored the other half of the coin, you might say. And so Shankara is emphasizing here that we try to detach ourselves from the one half we're stuck on and start noticing the other half here. So in another place, he says, no matter what a deluded person may think they're perceiving, they're really seeing Brahman and nothing else but Brahman. So at first he's saying distinguish between Brahman and non-Brahman. And now he's saying, well, actually, you're always already looking at Brahman, even though you think you're not. So he's now switched to an ultimate teaching. So he starts within this relative context, working with duality, and then he says, but remember, this is just a relative context. Don't even cling to that. And other mystics, of course, agree with this, that only in delusion is there a difference between the subject and the object. So Meister Eckhart, for example, says, some people think that they'll see God as if he were standing there and they here. It is not so. God and I, we are one. So there's no ultimate distinction between subject and object there. It's not like you're looking for God, you're looking for God, you're looking for God. How can you find God? Well, you're not going to find God out there as an object. Which isn't to say that there isn't value in the search within the relative context, which can exhaust itself and convince us that that relative context itself is part of the delusion. Similarly, only in delusion is there a self that can be deluded. In the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha says, "Through the consummation of incomparable enlightenment, I acquired not even the least thing." Menachem Nahum of Chernobyl said, "Finally he must realize that he has in fact attained nothing at all." So this comes at the end of the path, where the aspirant is trying to attain this elusive thing called gnosis, and then the ultimate realization is that, as Ramana Maharshi says, actually the self always is the self. There is no such thing as realizing it. You are the self. You're already that. So there's no getting to where you already are. There's no realizing what's already being realized right now without you realizing that it's being realized. And as Mao Tzu, the Chan master, said, this very mind is the Buddha mind. So it's not like you need to change your mind or get out of the mind, or as Dr. Wolf said, there's no, with realization, there's no change in the contents of consciousness. It's not like you have to get rid of this thought and replace it with something else, or change anything in experience whatsoever. It's realizing something about this experience as it already is and already was and always will be. So the teachings progress from these relative teachings to this absolute level. The relative teachings are like an antidote to a disease. And once they work to address that, you don't need them anymore. The other metaphor is the raft crossing the river. Once the raft has been used to cross the river, you don't need the raft anymore. So this fundamental distinction is really at the root of the whole context of the spiritual path and everything. And it is what allows there to appear an apparent world of multiplicity of things. As Ibn Arabi said, the root of all things is difference, and it's really this fundamental difference of this first distinction that allows all things to appear to be things, separate from other things and separate from the ultimate reality. Joel's teacher, Dr. Wolf, described this in his aphorisms, which are these very pithy, succinct descriptions that really have a lot packed into them. He suggested one way to work with these are as seeds to meditation. You could take one aphorism and just meditate on that. So these are really potent teachings. And in some of these aphorisms, he talks about this first distinction that creates the whole universe. He says, within the bosom of consciousness without an object, which is his term for ultimate reality, lies the power of awareness that projects objects. When objects are projected, the power of awareness as subject is presupposed. Yet consciousness without an object remains unchanged. When consciousness of objects is born, then likewise consciousness of absence of objects arises. Consciousness of objects is the universe. Consciousness of the absence of objects is nirvana. Within consciousness without an object lie both the universe and nirvana. Yet to consciousness without an object, both these are the same. So really he does it all here. He goes from the relative to the absolute, back to the relative to the absolute, and he's showing how this is all tied together. He's saying that within the bosom of consciousness without an object is this potential of imagination, you might say, to create this first distinction. And it arises, it seems to be created, and yet, he says, consciousness without an object is really unchanged. It just seems to be created, and that's part of the illusion of it being created, is it kind of creates itself, you might say, or it seems to create itself, and that's part of what it does. And by virtue of that, the whole universe of objects arises in contrast with the absence of that, which is what he calls nirvana. Form and emptiness, you might say. But he reminds us that all this is just illusion. All of this within consciousness without an object, both of these are the same. So don't forget that part. Reminds us at the end here. So this relative world arises and you can talk about it, but don't forget that it hasn't really arisen. It only seems to have arisen. Also wrapped up within this first distinction is the seed of time and the seed of space. So if you just rest in this moment and consider the arising of sounds, for example, any particular sound seems to be present in the moment that it's experienced, but then it seems as though it's gone. And that contrast is built upon a distinction between its being present and its being absent. And the sense of it being just a phenomena, apart from consciousness itself, which permeates all of this, is the sense that it is impermanent, that it has come from something that it isn't, some kind of nothingness. It's arisen. So when it has arisen, it seems, oh, there's something. It wasn't here before, kind of in the back of our minds. It wasn't here before. So implicit in just that simple experience of something seeming to arise is the built-in assumption that it wasn't there before. And so already right there is time. And also in that instant after it vanishes, it dissolves, there's a sense of, oh, it's not here anymore. So also there, oh, it's past. It's not here anymore. Now it's absent. So there's the contrast between its presence and its absence. And built in with that is a sense of before and after. So in that very first distinction is also this root, seed, and time. And that can unfold into whole stories of this happened before that and that happened before the other thing. Once you have lots of things, then you can order which came before the other and so on. And before you know it, you have histories of humanity and of the universe and everything. Similarly, the distinctions in space, the sense of a gong being here, for that to be experienced as something requires that it somehow be distinguished from other things, say over here. You wouldn't say the gong is over here, you'd say it's here. And so there's implicit in that this spatial distinction that's separating something here from something over here. If there wasn't such a distinction, you wouldn't say the gong arose in the visual field here. It would just be the whole visual field without any distinction. So in order for this to be isolated and cognized as something, it has to be distinguished in space to separate it from all these, everything else. So built into this distinction is also the seed of space. And then you can, of course, have all sorts of different things distinguished from each other. And before you know it, you have a whole world with space and time and all sorts of remarkable things happening. Wolff also has, if you're interested, some wonderful aphorisms about space and time also arising, the seed of space and the seed of time arising in consciousness. And he ends each one by reminding us that within consciousness without an object, both of these are the same, both before and after, both here and there. This distinction isn't actually a real distinction that's arising. One interesting property of the world that we experience is that it doesn't seem to be just a random cacophony, a phantasmagoria, just a whole bunch of random distinctions everywhere. You could imagine static on a TV screen when it's not tuned to any channel. It's just a bunch of noise without any objects that can be distinguished in there, without any sense of things coming and going. It's just a bunch of static. No order whatsoever. Our experience isn't like that. At least within the context of human experience, there's the sense of this body that kind of continues through time and objects that seem to persist through time. They can get destroyed and so on, but for a while at least it seems like, I don't know how many years this gong has been around, but it seems like it's hung around for a while and it's still here and has a lot of the properties that it had several years ago, at least as best as I can remember. May have changed a little bit, tarnished maybe, but there are certain properties that seem to have persisted through time that we can identify. And this is part of what allows us to speak coherently about this common world we share. We can all agree about the center building being here, and we can agree that we'll all come here on Sundays at 11, and sure enough, everyone shows up. So how do the mystics explain or understand this part of experience? Well, one way to think of it, and remember, we're still just talking about relative truth here. There's nothing absolute in any of this. So ultimately, this is all metaphor. But this power of imagination that Wolff talks about to create distinctions, to create objects, to project, it's, you might say, full of possibilities. So it could create distinctions that just come and go. It could create distinctions that persist maybe a little longer. It could create distinctions that seem to veil the underlying reality more or less. It could create distinctions that are kind of vague and fuzzy, or it could create distinctions that are really precise, very precisely defined distinctions. Many of our distinctions in natural language are kind of vague and imprecise, but they do pretty well. Distinctions between colors, for example, the distinction between blue and red. Or when is a couch red and when does it change into being maroon? People can argue about this. These aren't cut and fast distinctions. But one of the things that science and mathematics try to do is work with distinctions that are very precise. And that's one of the things that characterizes mathematics and science, is that it tries to make very precise distinctions. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But the idea here is that there's, in principle, the possibility, you might say, speaking poetically, that consciousness has the freedom to create all these different kinds of distinctions. It could be precise or imprecise, very transitory, somewhat permanent, and so on. And insofar as some of them, at least, might be more permanent than others, more persistent than others, or at least seem to be so, that can create a sense of there being a kind of fixed context. Just like the first distinction can seem to create a fixed context for all delusion to unfold, you can have other distinctions also that might create a fixed context. So an example might be when a community decides to adopt a common vocabulary to talk about something. They have definitions for their words, and insofar as they agree upon those definitions, they can communicate with each other about things that supposedly exist within that context. Mathematicians love to do this. They'll create a set of axioms that precisely define all sorts of abstract mathematical objects, and then they'll derive theorems about them and prove all sorts of fantastic things about these mathematical entities that they've defined with their definitions and axioms. And then they'll turn around and they'll change the axioms. They'll say, well, wait a minute, we don't have to talk about these axioms of Euclidean geometry. We could change one and say, well, you know, parallel lines don't have to stay parallel and not intersect. We could actually have them intersect, and lo and behold, you can study a whole different kind of non-Euclidean geometry where parallel lines intersect, just like the lines of longitude on the Earth intersect at the poles, even though they seem pretty parallel on small patches of the Earth. So within these relative contexts, there's the sense that something's fixed, at least temporarily fixed. And you could imagine that some of these fixed distinctions might be something like a sentient being that perceives the world in a particular way through certain sense organs. And that some of these persistent distinctions might be certain properties of the world that this sentient being experiences. And so some parts of the world might seem to persist relative to this context, which isn't an ultimate context, but it's a relative context. And the trick is that since it seems to persist a little while, we can get fooled and tricked into thinking that it's something real in and of itself. Ultimately, we confuse the relative with the absolute. So mathematicians, for example, thought for quite a while that Euclidean geometry was the only game in town. And then it was quite a surprise when some other mathematicians said, well, actually, we can have different kinds of geometry. And it opened up a whole new world of mathematics for them to study. So similarly, you could say, well, the context of a sentient being is just one relative framework that consciousness could possibly manifest distinctions as. It could also manifest all kinds of other possibilities. This is just one of them. So this gives us an understanding within this relative context of how it might be that out of nothing comes something, and not only just something, but something that seems to be more than just ephemeral, but seems to persist long enough that it fools us into thinking that it might actually be here forever. Something like the physical universe. So this brings us to the view of science. Now, most scientists, I think it's fair to say, take for granted that there is a physical world that exists independent of any human being and their capacity for observing it, that exists independent of any sentient being, that exists independent of any awareness or consciousness whatsoever, that there's just these atoms that are bouncing around, or to put it in more 21st century terms, there's just these quantum fields that vibrate in different ways and make it appear that there are these particles. And these laws that came from somewhere, we don't know where, but these laws that somehow govern how these things interact. And we do these experiments that match up with this description in quite a remarkable and convincing way that make it seem like this kind of physical world is actually out there. So these scientists do experiments, simple ones, huge complicated ones with gigantic particle accelerators. They'll make these precise measurements predicted by these theories, and they'll predict that when they collide certain particles together in the particle accelerator, there's a certain probability that they'll measure a certain energy spike at a certain frequency. Lo and behold, there it is. And they say they've discovered a particle, just as the theory predicted, which is quite remarkable. And this is consistent with the idea that there is a relative world that exists, but usually the scientists take it for granted or take the next step to assume that not only is this a relative world that exists relative to our scientific mode of investigating reality and observing reality, but that they really exist. So it's mistaking the relative for the absolute. Einstein said that the belief in an external world independent of the perceiving subject is the basis of all natural science. And in another place he said, physics is an attempt conceptually to grasp reality as it is thought, independently of its being observed. In this sense, one speaks of physical reality. So we're trying to imagine this thing called physical reality that exists independent of us. You might say this is the game that science is playing, just as the mathematicians defined their axioms for Euclidean geometry and decided to explore what kind of geometry what kind of laws are there for a geometry that is based on these axioms. Similarly, the physicists say, well, let's play this game. Let's look at reality and let's look at it through this particular lens. And here are the rules we're going to play by. One of the rules is we do experiments that can be replicated. You set it up in a very specific way, follow these rules for setting up your experiment, use these instruments, use these standardized measurement units, and see if you can repeatedly observe the same things if you set up the experiment in the same way each time. Well, this controlled experiment. And if you set it up in the same way each time, if you get the same result, then we'll call that a scientific measurement. Now, if you're not following all these rules, you're not playing the game of science. Just like if you change the axioms of Euclidean geometry, well, you're not studying Euclidean geometry anymore. It doesn't mean you're studying nonsense. You could be studying non-Euclidean geometry. It just means that you're not studying Euclidean geometry anymore. So the scientists play this game defined by science and its rules, and they get these repeatable measurement results. And then they do this marvelous thing. They take all these numbers and they put them together and they try to find a mathematical theory that makes sense of it all. Well, if you start with these numbers and you do this specific experiment, then we can calculate with our laws of physics that you should get these numbers if you do another experiment. It's called a prediction. And if they find the right theory, then this works. If it doesn't work, then, well, they have to change the theory and look some more to try and find another theory that makes all this work. So from the perspective of a physical realist, someone who believes that there is a real physical world out there, the physicist is engaged in this activity of trying to find the objectively true laws of nature that are already there, that govern how the objective world that is already there is behaving. But from a mystic's point of view, we could reframe this and say, well, the scientist is looking at reality through a very specific lens. And they have constructed this lens intentionally, by design, so that it picks out these distinctions in reality that are orderly and persistent, and ignores all the other stuff, all that flack, all the random stuff that you can't predict. And in fact, they've come up against some of these measurements that they just can't predict. Like in quantum theory, you've heard of probably the randomness of quantum experiments and how they've come up to this point where the predictions fail to be precise about the exact outcome of, for example, when will this radioactive atom decay? A physicist can't tell you whether it'll decay today or tomorrow. They can only tell you the probability that it'll decay today or tomorrow. And for different atoms, there will be a different probability. And they can be very precise about, oh, well, this is a cesium atom. It has a certain half-life, so it has a very definite probability of decaying over a certain amount of time. And they can be very precise about that. But they can't tell you, oh, it'll decay in 12 hours, 35 minutes, and 6 seconds. They just don't know. So they're hit up against this kind of fundamental randomness in the world, that some things happen that just can't be predicted, that are beyond the scope of this aspiration that science has to look at everything that is orderly. And so we have this possibility of looking at science in a different way. Now, the physicist could persist in maintaining that there really is a physical world out there. One of the problems with that is that in addition to leaving out all of the random stuff, it also leaves out something very fundamental and very obvious about reality, which is the fact of awareness, the fact of consciousness. Now, if I ask you if you're aware, hopefully you'll answer yes. But the question is, how do you know that? Is there something called awareness that you perceive? Is there some thought that comes up that tells you that yes, awareness is? Well, I think if you look very carefully, you'll see that when you ask the question, am I aware, the answer doesn't come from perception or conception. It's not a thought, it's not a perception. It's just kind of a brute fact of reality, that there's awareness. And because it isn't a perception or a conception, something we can really even point to in that kind of way, science can't study it. it's not an object of science. It's not something that can be the focus of something through the scientific lens, you might say. So if science says that the only thing that exists is this physical reality that we can see through this particular framework, then obviously it's leaving this out. So that, to my mind, is the most simple refutation of physical realism that there is. Just the fact of awareness, and that it's not an object, and because it's non-objective, it can't be the object of any scientific study. So if you're saying that anything that's real has to be the object of scientific study and verified by science, then it's going to leave this out. And so you can proceed fine and say, well, anything that is physically real is going to be the object of scientific study. That's fine. You're talking about a type of reality relative to this framework, and that's perfectly fine. But to claim that that's the absolute truth, that there's nothing else other than that one framework, is where the mistake is made. And as long as you don't make that mistake, well, then suddenly you're free to look at other frameworks and recognize that reality can be much more than you've dreamt of, Horatio. So that, in a nutshell, is how we can look at science from a mystical perspective and make sense of it. Maybe even make sense of it better than the scientists themselves can make sense of it. And we find this perspective by actually studying the mystics and how they describe reality as unfolding from this fundamental distinction, and this distinction between relative and absolute, and how knowledge can be valid within a context of certain distinctions, but that doesn't mean it's the ultimate reality. Because the one thing that distinguishes the mystics from not only scientists, but lots of other domains of knowledge, is that the mystic is always saying that, okay, here's my teaching, but it's not ultimately true. The reality is beyond this, what I'm saying. So if you could view all domains of knowledge with that same wisdom, then it has the potential of transforming all of our domains of knowledge and really opening them up to much more possibilities. So the hope is that this new worldview can put science in this broader context of understanding so that it can be seen as compatible with the mystical view, the mystical description of reality. That these are different ways of describing the same underlying reality, which is undescribable. These are different relative descriptions that both unfold out of this context of making a distinction. And hopefully, if we can have a worldview where both science and mysticism aren't at odds with each other and can harmonize within this broader understanding, then we can have perhaps a world culture that can integrate the insights of mysticism and religion together with the insights of science and technology. It's most likely, unless civilization completely collapses, science isn't going away. And so if we want a worldview or an understanding in which science is compatible with mysticism, we need this broader framework. And if we can have that, then there's the possibility that they can live side by side more harmoniously. And people who, like myself, who are very interested in science, that shouldn't be a barrier to investigating mysticism, following a spiritual path, seeking enlightenment. So a worldview can hopefully do that for people. And that's one of the missions at the center. Are there any questions or comments? I saw you raise your hand earlier, Mark.
From your description, it sounds like compatibility between the mystical worldview and the scientific worldview can only really be had from the mystical side, because the mystical side can recognize the value of science in the relative sense, but science may or may not be able to accept, maybe with quantum mechanics it can, but may not be able to accept the mystical worldview that all of its everything is still relative.
So as long as the scientist is clinging to physical realism as being metaphysically true, the scientist is stuck in a kind of delusion there, from the mystic's perspective, right? One of the things the scientist should recognize and admit is that this is ultimately a hypothesis, that just like all scientific truth, it's not an established scientific truth that physical realism is true. It's a philosophical framework that scientists just take for granted. It's not itself a theory of science. So the fact that certain measurements can be reproduced, you might say that is a fact of science. But you don't have to go from there to logically conclude that that means that it's physically real, ultimately physically real. You can say it's real within that context, just like a mathematician will say within a certain context, oh yes, well, the number 1/2 is real, the number pi is real, but that's just using a word in that context. You could change your axioms and then it's no longer exists anymore from another perspective. So maybe one answer to your question is, yeah, as long as the physicists insist on demanding that reality be confined to what they're doing, what can you do other than ask them to politely challenge their assumptions or back them up using their own methods?
Wasn't Edwin Schrödinger a mystic? He was one of the founders of quantum physics.
He was, yeah. Yeah, he was a follower of Advaita Vedanta and, read Shankara and all of that. The interesting twist to that is that he, before he went into physics, he wanted to go into philosophy. And he was a follower before he ever discovered the Schrödinger equation of quantum mechanics.
It's interesting because you'd think that just seeing into the nature of, through the mathematics, seeing into the nature of what they're discovering, that it would be a revelation of some sort. I mean, because it's pretty profound when you look at quantum physics, what it's pointing out.
Yeah. Yeah, and relativity also. There are a lot of these scientific revolutions that have taken place where physicists have had to surrender some of the pretty fundamental ideas about what this physical reality they believe in consists of. So Newton created this remarkable physical theory, and he had certain ideas about the nature of space and time and so on, and gravity. And then Einstein comes along, and well, space and time aren't really what Newton thought they were ultimately, and gravity isn't what Newton thought it was ultimately. You have to surrender those as being absolute ideas and recognize that, well, there's actually something more fundamental that's true here. And what Newton thought was actually relatively true within a limited context. And so this kind of thing, when I think if you talk to physicists about this sort of thing happening within physics, they can start to think, well, yeah, that's right. You know, paradigms change, and so our ideas of what physical reality changes, and so, well, what we believe now actually might have to change sometime too. So maybe that's not the final physical reality. There might be something more fundamental yet. And from that perspective, what we think now might have to be seen as just as contingent and relative as what Newton was thinking before Einstein. So this kind of discussion, which is why I think it's really valuable for physicists to study the history of science and these revolutions and what happened with the changes in the concepts with these revolutions, and to study the philosophy of science, because there are also lots of lessons to be learned there about the nature of scientific knowledge and how it can never actually prove anything. It can only falsify things. You have a hypothesis, and actually there could be a dozen other hypotheses that fit the same data. And so how do we know the one that we picked is the truth? Well, we don't. There could be other ways of explaining the same data. We could do an experiment that proves that the one we have is wrong, then we'd have to pick one of the others maybe. But that's all we can do, is kind of eliminate what's not right. But what we're left with isn't one unique truth. It's like in quantum mechanics, it undermines a lot of preconceptions we had about the world, just like relativity does. But when it comes to saying, well, what does quantum mechanics say about what the world is really like? There are about a dozen different interpretations of quantum mechanics, which is to say that a dozen different ways of taking the mathematics and saying, what kind of world does this describe? Well, there are some physicists that adopt the many worlds interpretation. They say, well, this mathematics obviously describes many worlds that are coming, that are all exist within the universal wave function. And it's a remarkable perspective to consider. But other physicists say, that's crazy. All these different worlds, you can't verify any of them, and you know, all of this metaphysical garbage, and that doesn't make any sense at all, even though it's very mathematically elegant. They think it's much more reasonable to just interpret quantum mechanics this way. There's really a collapse of the wave function, and it's not some mysterious thing happening in the physical world. It has to do with how our knowledge is being updated. And so David Bohm had an interpretation where there's this quantum potential that exists everywhere and kind of connects everything non-locally. There's, like I said, a dozen different interpretations. And here's the thing. They all agree with the data. So you're not going to do an experiment to say which one is right and which one is wrong. It's like I put up a painting on the wall and I say, well, what is this describing? And there can be as many different interpretations as there are people in the room. Well, there's not a right or a wrong one. Even though we can still all agree, well, there are certain splotches of certain colors in certain locations, and the painting was painted in a certain time by a certain person, and there's a lot of kind of objective things we can agree about the painting, just like the physicists agree about the measurements they're making and about the Schrodinger equation. Yes, they all agree this is the Schrodinger equation. What does it mean? Well, then some of them just throw up their hands and say, shut up and calculate. Other physicists say, that's a cop-out. We should be thinking about what it really means. And, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all again for coming. Till we see you again, peace to you all.